Hi there, this is Dr. Patrick Keelan, registered psychologist, Dr. Pat for short. And what I thought I would do is make this video to give you some ideas on how to cope more effectively with the stress of the coronavirus pandemic. It's a difficult time for everyone, including me. And I thought it might be helpful if I shared some of the coping strategies that I've been using to get through this stressful time. And these are some ideas that I've also shared with my clients. And also, some of these ideas have come from other sources that I've heard about. So let's get to it. One of the strategies is social connection. I made it a point to seek out social connection through various means during this stressful time. Video chat is a common way through the various video chat platforms. Also, been doing lots of texting, emails, phone calls as well. And the people I've been connecting with, family members, friends, colleagues, coworkers, I've found that the social connection has not only been helpful for taking my mind off the stress of the pandemic, I found the greater time I have available for social connection has allowed me to connect at a deeper level with a lot of people compared to before the pandemic. So that's been a pleasant surprise. Another coping strategy I've been using is regular exercise. I exercise regularly every day except one that I take off to give my muscles and mind a break. Apart from that, exercise regularly. And the exercise I do, typically what I've been doing is doing bike spin workouts in my living room on my bike trainer. And I've been getting really good workout, a cardio workout that way. I also do some strength exercises at home. I find the exercise is really good for coping with stress, both because it gives me a sense of accomplishment each day from having done the workout. Also, the cardio exercise I find very relaxing to the body. And if your body can be relaxed and calm, it makes it a lot easier for your mind to be calm and your emotions to be calmer as well. So I highly recommend exercise during this pandemic. There's different ways you can do the exercise, obviously. I do the bike spinning, as I said. If you have a treadmill at home, which I don't, you could do runs indoors. You could go outside, certainly, as long as you keep the social distance from other people. And other forms of exercise also effective during this time. So exercise is another good coping strategy. Another coping strategy is having activities scheduled during the day regularly, having a routine, in other words. Exercise is part of that, as is social connection. But other kinds of activities I look forward to during the day. Give myself a break from dwelling on worries about the pandemic and let my mind focus on more enjoyable activities. Now, the activities that I schedule into my routine, usually it's a combination of what I would call pleasurable activities and mastery activities. Pleasurable activities, as the name suggests, enjoyable, relaxing activities. For me, these would be things like reading novels, watching television, playing games on the internet or crossword puzzles in the newspaper. Social interactions, another pleasurable activity as well. Watching movies, watching television, those kinds of things. And even enjoying a good meal is a pleasurable activity. Mastery activities, those are activities where I'm accomplishing something or working on a goal or a purposeful activity. Those for me would be things like exercise, as well would be things like, for me, is playing the piano because I'm learning to play it. I'm taking lessons. I'm working toward taking my piano exam in the not too distant future. So that's a nice, good scheduled activity that I do regularly each day that gives me some purpose and focus. If you have enough activities scheduled during the day, you'd be amazed of how your mind is not occupied by worries about the pandemic. Give yourself a break from that, and how the time can kind of fly by if you do that. Mastery activities as well, I should mention, can also encompass your work if you're still working during this pandemic. My work is down in terms of amount compared to before the pandemic, but I still do see some clients, primarily or exclusively, I should say, by video chat. And that's another mastery activity. A mastery activity is one where you're using your talents and skills. And if you're doing your job and you're good at it, as I'm sure you are, well, that can be good mastery activity. Take your mind off your problems. Mastery activity is really good for the self-esteem, I should mention. Now, other things that I've done during this pandemic that I've found helpful for coping with it would be exposing myself selectively to information about the pandemic. Now, selectively, that term means that I limit how much information I expose myself to about the pandemic. I don't want it to be an all-encompassing thing that I'm dwelling on it constantly. So I limit myself how much time I spend thinking about the pandemic and exposing myself to information about it. And I'm also selective in terms of the sources of information that I expose myself to. So I like to expose myself to accurate sources of information about the pandemic, but also source of information which balance the genuine negative information with also positive and optimistic information, realistically optimistic information. So some of these sources of information would be the news outlets, some of them like CBC and CTV, I find are pretty good for that. CNN in the US is good for that, I've found as well. Also, programs about the pandemic that I like watching, personalities on those programs. Dr. Phil, I think, has done lots of good stuff about the pandemic, accurate but also positive in terms of giving good coping skills to viewers. I'll leave aside Dr. Phil's ill-fated appearance on Fox News where he said some things that I don't think he should have said. I'll cut him some slack on that because I think he's done a great job on his program, the Dr. Phil, giving people good information about the pandemic. Other programs I watch, CNN, the hosts on there, Anderson Cooper, his show, and as well Chris Como, CNN host as well. Chris Como contracted COVID-19, so on his show each day he's done a great job of continuing to broadcast despite the fact that he's undergoing the symptoms of the pandemic. I think that's been great in terms of he's helped people to see what it's like to have this virus, and he really did scare me into making sure I don't contract it as much as possible. I didn't know what it was like to contract it fully before I had watched him go through the suffering of it. So I think he's done a great job with that. Some other TV personalities and shows, At Issue on CBC, the panelists on that show, I watch them regularly. I think they give good information about the pandemic. And CTV, the program Question Period is good for that as well. And the panelists on that show, not to confuse it with Question Period from the House of Commons in Canada. Another personality that I've watched regularly appears on CNN typically. They broadcast his news conferences, is the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, brother of Chris Cuomo, the CNN host. I think Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, has done the best of any leader I've seen throughout this pandemic as far as being a leader during a crisis. I think he's done a great job with the two tasks I think a leader should perform during a difficult situation. One is to inform people properly and take effective action. And then the other task, I think, is for the leader to inspire people, inspire his constituents or her constituents, and motivate them to stay strong and do what it takes to get through this difficult time. From what I've seen of him, he's done a great job on both counts. He's been very effective from a task-oriented perspective, an action-oriented perspective, but also connecting with people personally and sharing personal stories and inspiring people. And my hat's off to him. And I think the people of New York are fortunate to have such a great leader as that through this crisis. So I've really tuned into him each day, and I think I get inspired by him even though he's not even in my country. Some of the other things that I found helpful during this pandemic as far as coping with the stress of it is thinking about the pandemic in a balanced way. And that means thinking about negative information that I need to think about, but don't think about just the negative information. Balance it with thinking about the accurate positive information. And that entails also not overestimating the negativity in terms of the likelihood of negative things happening, and also not underestimating my ability to cope with those negative things, whether they be health concerns or economic negative events. So I think that's important to do that. Think about things in a balanced way. The other piece, as far as a coping strategy, which is related to thinking about things in a balanced way, is focus as much as possible on the positives during the day. There's going to be lots of negatives to focus on during the day, and I don't ignore those, but I make sure that I balance it by looking for and focusing on the genuine positives during the day. It's easy to preoccupy yourself with just noticing the negatives, and that's going to have an excessively negative effect on your mood and your stress if you do that. I think if you focus on the positives and look for them, that can have a balancing effect on your thinking and on your mood and your stress. Now, a way to do that I came across from when I was watching Dr. Phil's show, and he had a psychiatrist guest. He had a great idea, which is fairly simple, but I hadn't thought of it, is at the beginning of the stage, focus on the positives, and at the end of the day, focus on the positives. Beginning of the day, focus on the positives by making it a point to tell yourself that it's going to be a good day and a positive day, an enjoyable day. And also make it a point to tell yourself that you will look for the positives during the day. So that sets the stage for noticing positives during the day that you might overlook. Positive events, positive people, positive actions, positive activities, those kinds of things. So that's one piece. If you notice those positives during the day by having the mindset established at the beginning of the day to look for the positives, I think that'll have a good positive effect on your mood and your stress. At the end of the day, also notice the positives. Now, the way I do that is at the end of each day, it's usually just before I go to bed, I go through my day and I start enumerating out loud, typically to myself, what were some of the positives that happened to me during the day? Positive events, positive people, positive activities, those kinds of things. I go through the day in that way, and I'm usually able, by thinking about it, come up with a large number of positives during the day. People, events, activities, positives of all kinds. And when I do it that way, I find that I'm maximizing the noticing of the positives to balance with the genuine negatives. And that has a balancing effect on my mood and a balancing effect on my stress levels as well. So making it a point to notice the positives, I think, is very important, and that's a nice, good, systematic way to do it that I've been using. Now, another thing to think about that'll offer you as far as coping strategies would be, I've tried to notice during this pandemic some of the lessons that I've learned from this pandemic as far as, excuse me, some positives that I can take away from this pandemic that I would not have occurred if were it not for the pandemic happening. Not to say that I would have liked this pandemic to happen. I wish it hadn't happened, but some of these positives I think would not have occurred were it not for the pandemic. So some of the ones that I've noticed that I'm going to take away and continue after this crisis is over. One is appreciating the slower pace that I've been enjoying during this pandemic. It's been slower by necessity because I don't work as much as before the pandemic. I'm not commuting as much, but I've really started to enjoy it, the slower pace. And so when it comes back to reinstating the previous pace that I had before the pandemic, I think I'm not going to go back to the previous pace. I'm going to maintain, to some extent at least, the slower pace. It's more relaxing and less stressful. Tied in with that I've really noticed that I appreciate not having to commute as much and how much I enjoy not having to do that commuting. I find that commuting and driving, it's just been a lot of time that I don't particularly enjoy. So if I can cut down on doing that commuting at least some extent after this pandemic is over, I think I will do it. Related to that, I've discovered during the pandemic that I can do a lot of my work remotely at home by video. Don't have to do sessions in person. Now, I did some in video sessions before the pandemic, but they were more the exception than the rule. And they were out of necessity. If I was working with somebody at a distance or somebody who had to stay at home because they were going through an injury, perhaps, or maybe they were pressed for time and they couldn't make it to the office on time, we'd do a video session. Now it's become the norm and the rule that I'm doing video sessions. I've discovered, for the most part, I can do them with clients just as effectively as before the pandemic. And so I think I'm going to try to do more of that on an ongoing basis and offer it to clients after the pandemic is over, even if they could come to the office. And if I can do more sessions at home and not have to commute as much and do more sessions by video, I think that would be good for me as well. So I think it could be a win-win for clients and for me to do more of those video sessions after this pandemic is over. As well, I've noticed during the pandemic that I've come to appreciate the more in-depth level of social connection that I've had with people during this pandemic compared to before. I thought Governor Cuomo made this point very well. He talked about before the pandemic, he'd have conversations with his adult daughters that were very brief and fleeting before the pandemic. And then during the pandemic, though, he's been able to have some in-depth conversations. Just because he has more time available for them. And he's been able to connect with them at a much deeper level and a much more rewarding level. I found that as well with the conversations I've been having with family members and friends and coworkers and colleagues. I found them much more rich and rewarding and more intimate. And I'm going to want to keep up that after the pandemic is over, just like Governor Cuomo said he's going to keep it up. So that's something I've discovered from the pandemic, like the governor did. So I'm going to keep that up, definitely. More in-depth social interaction. I've also noticed during this pandemic that there's a lot of activities that I don't do now because I can't because of the pandemic that I think I'm going to appreciate more being able to do them once the pandemic is over. Some basic things that I took for granted, like going to a restaurant or working out at the gym, having coffee with a friend in a coffee shop. Kind of did that just regularly before the pandemic, and I think I might have took it for granted. I won't take it for granted once this is over. Watching sporting events is another one. I liked sports a lot, and sports has kind of taken a hiatus during this pandemic, and I missed it. I'm going to appreciate it more once the pandemic is over. I think not having a sports has required me and other sports fans to find some other ways to fill the void as far as enjoyable activities, but that's not incompatible with my appreciating how much I enjoyed sports before the pandemic, and I'll enjoy it, I think, even more once it's come back after the pandemic. I'll probably keep, in fact, I'm sure I will keep some of those new activities once the pandemic is over, but I'll go back to sports with a newfound appreciation for how much I've enjoyed watching them. So that's about it. Those are some ideas from my standpoint as far as some strategies to help you cope with the stress of the pandemic and how to manage things mood-wise and emotion-wise. I hope this was helpful. I have more information on my website as well. If you'd like to go there, some more videos. I have lots of blog articles on my website as well on the pandemic and on other issues. My website, www.drpatrickkeelan.com. That's my website. And feel free to go there. And I hope you're doing reasonably well and coping as well as you can during this pandemic. And hopefully I will connect with you soon with another one of these videos. Okay, this is Dr. Patrick Keelan, registered psychologist, Dr. Pat for short. And have a good day. Bye for now.